This afternoon, we're in for a rare treat. Toscanini called Elisabeth Rethberg the greatest living soprano. Bodansky and Mengelberg agreed she was the finest vocal artist of the day and hailed her as the most versatile singer since Lily Lehman. In her first season at the Metropolitan, she sang such diverse roles as Aida, Sophie, Nedda, and Sieglinde. No other soprano has done all those parts in an entire career. In 20 years here, she sang 30 roles in Italian, German, and French. It's another 20 years since her last performance, but her memory is evergreen, and she's with us here this afternoon. Today's musical biography is in reality an autobiography by Elisabeth Rethberg.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. But today's story is different from any you have had on your other third intermissions.
How's that, Madam Rethberg?
A few weeks ago, you told the story of a soprano who wanted a career more than anything in the world and who succeeded in spite of everything. My story is of someone who didn't want a career and was pushed into it in spite of everything.
Frankly, I've often wondered how anyone so sweet, so truly modest and unassuming as Elisabeth Rethberg ever wound up in the theater at all, where the arena sometimes gets a little bloody.
Well, I was a student at the Royal Conservatory in Dresden. Fritz Reiner discovered me, and I went literally from the classroom to the stage of the Dresden Opera. My father had to come from Schwarzenberg, our hometown, to sign the contract because I was still underage.
And your debut was in The Gypsy Baron, I believe.
Not quite. My actual debut was as one of the pages in Lohengrin.
But since your first principal role was in Gypsy Baron, how about something from that as our first musical number?
I would like to point out that first I sang Arsena and later Safi.
So let's hear the end of the Zigeuner Lied, Safi's Gypsy song, from the first act. For the next 7 years, Elisabeth Rethberg remained as leading soprano of the Dresden Opera, making guest appearances in many of the leading opera houses throughout Europe. Now, Madam Rethberg, tell us how you came to the Metropolitan.
Again, it was in spite of myself. I never sought a Metropolitan contract, and this is a story. It was summer, and Bodansky was in Berlin. I went along with a tenor who had an audition. We were passing through between engagements and had been standing up all night on the train. I had nothing else to do and was just killing time. Somebody asked me why I didn't sing. I honestly didn't want to, but Bodansky finally persuaded me.
And I dare say you recall that fateful audition number.
Oh, like yesterday. It was the aria from Der Freischütz.
An opera we don't hear so much today, but here's Elisabeth Rethberg singing Agatha's lovely prayer, Leise, leise, fromme Weise. I know our friends this afternoon would be as interested as I was to hear how you missed your scheduled debut at the Metropolitan.
Ah, Mr. Robinson, I was so naive. I didn't know one had to check in at the Opera House. I was also deeply unhappy my first days in New York, and I just stayed in my hotel. I was scheduled to make my debut as Sophie in Rosenkavalier, and the date simply slipped by.
And finally, a frantic management located you in your hotel just 15 blocks north of the Opera House.
Yes, and instead of Rosenkavalier, I was announced for Aida.
I remember Howard Taubman of the Times telling me how they cornered Mr. Gatti and asked why he was giving us a German Aida.
And Mr. Gatti shouted, "If I had an Italian Aida, do you think I would be giving you a German?"
But his fears and the apprehensions of the press proved to be unfounded. Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians says it all in one simple sentence. There was no finer Aida in her generation than Elisabeth Rethberg. Madame Rethberg says she doesn't like her records, and while I can't understand it, I'm beginning to believe it. Her collection of her own records is far from complete, and many of those she does own look as though she'd used them for target practice. I did, however, get her to admit that one was pretty good, and that's the duet with Amonasro from the Nile scene of Aida. There's one phrase that's unforgettable. Listen to what she puts into Aida's heartbreaking line, "O patria, patria, quanto mi costi." "Oh, my country, what you're costing me." The baritone is Giuseppe De Luca, who often sang the part with Madame Rethberg. Another great Verdi role for you was Desdemona.
Yes. Othello hadn't been given at the Metropolitan since the days of Toscanini. Mr. Gatti asked Melchior and me to do the last act for his farewell. And then Mr. Johnson made a new production for Martinelli and Tippett.
And Elisabeth Rethberg. I think the next big peak we should contemplate in your career is your singing of Mozart. Madame Rethberg was the Contessa in the all-star revival of The Marriage of Figaro, which had been absent from the repertoire here for 22 years and helped put Mozart back on the gold standard at the Metropolitan. It was also the first opera to be broadcast under Texaco's sponsorship 22 years ago, December 7, 1940, and with Elisabeth Rethberg.
One of my first records, Mr. Robinson, was Pamina's aria from the Magic Flute.
And how beautiful it is. I think we've time for a bit of it. Another high point of Madame Rethberg's artistic life was her return to Dresden to create the leading role in the Egyptian Helen by Richard Strauss. And there are a number of works like Africana and The Sunken Bell which haven't been given at the Metropolitan since Elisabeth Rethberg sang them here. Let's listen to a passage now from the first act aria of L'Africana.
Mr. Robinson, now, for a very special reason, I want you to play something from the Meistersinger.
I'd be delighted. What about the enchanting moment in the third act when Eva comes into Sachs's cobbler shop under the pretext her shoe is too tight, when in reality she wants to find out more about young Walter von Stolzing? Madam Rethberg, what special significance does Meistersinger hold for you?
I was singing Eva the night George Sehanovsky made his debut at the Metropolitan as Kotner in the Meistersinger.
And for those of you who don't already know it, Elisabeth Rethberg, in about as happy a private life as anyone could imagine, is Mrs. George Tchaikovsky. And this brings us to about as good a time as any and better than most to introduce our dear friend, George, who's Baron d'Aubigny in this afternoon's performance of Traviata. It's his 1,526th performance at the Metropolitan.
Thank you, Francis. After 36 straight years in this theater, I'm still as proud as I was on that first night to be a member of this great company.
The feeling, George, I assure you, is mutual. George Tchaikovsky has been at the Metropolitan longer than any principal artist in our history. But statistics are only one, and not always a major consideration in the whole picture. There's no artist on the roster more respected and beloved.
Thank you, Francis.
And now, George, what would be your choice among the beautiful records of Elisabeth Rethberg?
Oh, I would love to hear In der Fremde by Taubert.
Splendid. A magnificent recording and also something of a mystery. For some reason I've never been able to fathom, it was never released. So our friends on this broadcast are actually in on a first performance by Elisabeth Rethberg. It was Schiller who said, "To love a beautiful woman is in itself a liberal education," which would make George Tchaikovsky, for having been able to woo and win Elisabeth Rethberg, the gray-eyed, the golden, a candidate for highest honors.